Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Marissa Khurma, and I'm the director of the Middle East program. Welcome to the Wilson Center Women's History Month book talk, featuring the New York Times bestseller, Daughters of Kobani, a story of rebellion, courage, and justice, by the highly acclaimed author Gayle Tzemach Lemmon, who's also written two other New York Times bestsellers, Ashley's War and The Dressmaker of Khairkhana. Daughters of Kobani is truly an inspiring compilation of stories of bravery and leadership and hope of women combatants in northeastern Syria who fought rigid sociocultural constructs in a region still regarded as a seat of patriarchy in order to face off against the ultimate enemy, ISIS or Daesh. As a woman born and raised in neighboring Jordan, and given our evidence-based work here at the Middle East Women's Initiative at the Wilson Center, I can attest to the myriad challenges that women face across the MENA region. That's why we see so few women in leadership positions, more rarely so in the military. But I can equally attest to the rise of more and more women taking charge and exercising leadership in every domain. And that's why everyone should read Daughters of Kobani. Gayle does a brilliant job of weaving these women's stories together into the very complex geopolitics and great power competition that plays out in Syria. So welcome, Gayle. Gayle will be in discussion on the book with the Honorable Senator Jean Shaheen of New Hampshire, who is a leader on US policy on Syria and has established the Syria Study Group, which led legislation based on the study group's recommendations. So welcome, Senator Shaheen. And last but not least, delighted to have Andrea Mitchell, award-winning Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent and anchor at NBC News, to lead the discussion and moderate. So thanks, Andrea, and the virtual Zoom floor is yours to kick us off. Thank you.
Wilson Center for this opportunity to talk, first of all, with this about this wonderful book with someone I admire so greatly, and to be with Senator Shaheen, who has led the way in advocating not only on other foreign issues and on Syria, but for women around the world and here at home on armed services and also foreign relations and in all of her work. So it is a great honor for me to be here today. This book is a work of love and compassion by Gayle, a journalist I so greatly admire, whom I first met in Afghanistan, I think. And I've heard about her work, her 7 trips to the region for years, and have been worried about her safety, knowing something of what happens to women in conflict zones, to all people in conflict zones. But I didn't fully understand the passion and compassion she had for her subjects, for General Nowruz, the commander of this all-women's militia, and some of the other heroic figures, until I read the manuscript myself and was just completely overtaken with it. It's just the most extraordinary narrative about these heroic women fighting to save home and homeland, and women who started out, some of them in their teens, with no experience in this, fighting even for basic women's rights, to be able to play soccer, to choose their own husbands, to go to university. And here instead, they're commanding a militia that defeats ISIS and earns the respect of the best special forces that we have in their 4-star general. So that's my summary, my takeaway. Gayle, talk to me about what led you to this mission and just what your discovery was.
So I'm so honored to be here with you, Andrea, obviously an amazing storyteller who really takes seriously trying to shed light and really illuminate conversations. And obviously Senator Shaheen, who I would hear about frequently on the ground in northeastern Syria, and people would say, Senator Shaheen was here. And I said, yes, I really understand the power of having representation on the ground. People would speak to me about that frequently. This story started when one of the US soldiers from Florida, actually, who had been part of Ashley's War, my second book, called me from the ground in Syria. She WhatsApped me and said, you have to come. You have to see what's happening here because it looks different. Not only are women leading in battle, but they're leading men in battle. And they have the full respect of the men alongside whom they fight, as well as the US, right? Elite soldiers, as Andrea was talking about, right? Folks who've done 13, 14, 15 deployments in the post 9/11 conflicts on behalf of the United States. And she said, and the thing is, Gayle, it's not just that they're fighting for, the defeat of the Islamic State. They're also fighting for women's equality and women's emancipation. And at that point, you think, who could have invented this showdown between the men who bought and sold women as a central part of who they were, when you think about the Islamic State, and a militia and a fighting force that had women's equality and women's emancipation, not at the periphery, but at the heart and at the core of who they were and what motivated them. And I wanted to start the story where it all began, between the United States and this fighting force, which was in the battle for the town of Kobani, which was a David versus Goliath showdown at a moment that ISIS had not had one single battlefield loss. And in this case, David also was a woman. As the world looked on, and NBC, Richard Engel is there, right? CNN is putting this on in real time, and watches this showdown between this fighting force few had ever heard of outside the region, and certainly in the United States, in a town that few had ever heard of, very much in the United States, and ISIS, which was then at that point creating a truly terrifying threat to Europe, to the United States, and certainly to the region. And so I thought, as a storyteller, who wouldn't want to understand how in the world one of the most far-reaching experiments in women's equality anywhere had been launched on the ashes of the fight against ISIS, created in part by women who fought ISIS room by room and house by house and town by town for a half decade. And I wanted readers to really feel that. I wanted them to feel like they were in the next room as they were really facing down ISIS, not just for the sake of this town, but really for the world.
Well, which you completely accomplish in the book. Senator, you've spent so much time on the ground in these zones and northeastern Syria and elsewhere. What strikes you about these women and their resolve, and what Gayle has, the story that she's told, so honestly?
First of all, let me just add my accolades to yours about the book. It is a wonderful book, and the scenes from the women fighting in Kobani and Manbij and Raqqa were just spellbinding. Watching Azima, who was one of the central characters, talk about what she was feeling and thinking in the fight for Kobani was just, I couldn't put it down. And I had the opportunity to visit Syria in the summer of 2018 after those battles were over. And what brought me there was because James Foley, who, as you mentioned in the book, his murder is probably the thing that most awakened the Western world to what was happening with ISIS. And he was a constituent of mine, and I knew that the families were really interested in trying to find out what had happened to him. And so I went because we knew that two of the terrorists suspected of his murder and the murder of other Americans were being held in Syria, in Kobani, coincidentally. But what happened when I got to Syria and got on the ground was to be so fascinated by what had happened there, by the role of women, as you point out so well in the book, and the difference that they made in taking back northeastern Syria from ISIS. And it was interesting reading your account and having been on the congressional side as we watched the Obama administration trying to figure out how we were going to fight ISIS and the starts and stops with that. And then having you describe what actually happened there in terms of the women who were fighting and how they joined the Syrian Democratic Forces. And I got a chance to see the difference that it made, to talk to some of those women and to ask them about their experiences, and then to see the difference that it made in terms of governing, how they had put together the governing councils that included not just minorities from the communities, but also the women who had equal rule to the men who are on those governing councils. And so it is an amazing story, and one that we can't let stop at this point, because Syria is still a mess, to put it bluntly, and the United States still has an interest in what happens in Syria, and the women who have fought. We want to continue to support their efforts for equality for women.
How do we maintain a stake there, given that we've withdrawn so much of our imprint and are really there in a skeletal presence now?
Well, one of the things that I worked to get through was the Syria Study Group report with recommendations on what to do in Syria. And while some of those recommendations are out of date now, a number of them are still relevant. Certainly the ability to get our allies to work with us in providing humanitarian aid, recognizing that leaving the playing field there to Russia and Iran is not in America's interest, recognizing the strategic importance of Syria in the region. And to have had allies, the Syrian Democratic Forces and the women of the YPJ who fought there, for the previous administration to have undercut everything that we stood for in northeastern Syria is really disappointing. No, I remember being there, and I'm sure you heard this too, Gayle. When I was there, everybody we talked to, both Kurds and Arabs, talked about the importance of the United States staying there, providing a backstop for what was happening, because it was so important to stability. And we saw those communities. I was in Manbij and Ayanisa beginning to rebuild. And people settling there and feeling good about the fact that they defeated ISIS, but very worried about what was going to happen next, what was going to happen with Assad, with ISIS coming back, with Turkey. And for America to pull out was just undercutting our allies in a way that I had not seen in my time in the Senate.
Gayle, what do you think the attitude is towards the United States now in the region and among the women in particular? Do they feel abandoned?
I would say this. There's a great deal of hope on the ground that sometimes can feel far away when you're in Washington, and when there's sort of the sense of what we cannot do sometimes overrides the sense of what we can. There is hope in abundance there, in part because of what they achieved, right? Of who they faced down. You know, if you go up against ISIS, if they're on a radio with you, as the book really takes you into, saying, we're going to come kill you, we're going to come enslave you, all of these things, and your side proves victorious, and not only proves victorious in battle, but helps to put in place a governance piece where women do have a voice across communities, right? I think that does give you a sense, and I joke about this, but it's really true. In the book I was writing, that nowhere in the world have I seen women more comfortable with power and less apologetic about exercising it. And I do think that comes from ideology, but it also comes from battlefield victory and from a governance structure that says women should be here and codifies that. So I think there is a lot of hope, and I think there's a huge question mark of what comes next, right? And in the end of the book, I talk about how the ending of this story is written in invisible ink that no one can yet decipher. And I think that remains the case, even as this remains not about what nice thing. I know Senator Shaheen and I have talked about Afghanistan too over the years, and concern for Afghan women. This is not a question of anybody outside putting in place these structures. It's not about whether it's nice to have women's participation. This is about US national security and the urgency of keeping the pressure on the Islamic State. And these folks are central to that pressure. And so I think that's the question mark that is seeking to be answered.
Well, and absolutely, as you say, we know that ISIS is still there, and that there's the potential for them to appear again in great numbers, and having fighters on the ground and having women who, as you and Andrea pointed out, are just totally opposite of everything that ISIS stands for. if ISIS is black, the women fighters there are white because they have proven themselves in so many ways and have made good out of so much of the evil that ISIS did on the ground there, is just something that we want to maintain and preserve.
And yeah, I was thinking it might be helpful to people for you to talk about some of the amazing characters, perhaps Tzemach, whom the senator mentioned, and Nowruz, what they achieved.
And you and I talked about this during the reporting process, Andrea. It's hard to know from the outside, was this, and I talked about this in the prologue, were these people real? Who were they? Where did they come from? What motivated them? And I think so many times we see women who do extraordinary things as superheroes, but they're not. They're just people who are practiced in the very female art of getting it done. And I wanted people to really meet them and see how different they were. Where you have Rojda, who becomes America's interlocutor in the fight to retake Raqqa from ISIS, right? Is talking with special operations forces multiple times per day about this. You know, she's introvert, really quiet, loves Diego Maradona, you know, challenged her whole family by playing soccer as a girl in her grandmother's village, which was seen as shameful, but would much rather be with a book than doing anything else, right? And then you have Tzemach, who's, you know, very much her best friend and dear friend, and lifelong friend, who is the opposite, right? Swashbuckling, chain smoking, you know, the kind of person, if you were at a dinner, you would want to sit right next to you, because she would always have something very wry and funny to say. Also a high school volleyball star who felt very deeply that Kobani wasn't going to fall, even at a moment when almost nobody else felt that way. Right. And there's a moment in the story where she gets a call from her sister in the middle of the battle for Kobani, and she really gives it to her sister. And I wanted people to see the humanity, right? That these women were also daughters and sisters and friends, in addition to our best hope to stopping ISIS. And then you have Zareen, who I think has moved so many people, because, you know, my mother-in-law, who might be watching today, was talking about how when she came up, there were kind of three paths. You could be a secretary, a nurse, or a teacher, right? And this is a young woman who kind of faced the same thing in a very different context. Wanted to go to university, couldn't, because women in her family don't do that, her uncle said. Then later wanted to marry somebody she loved. And again, women in our family don't do that. Your uncle already has chosen someone for you. And she says, no, if that's the case, then I'm never going to marry. And when she gets a knock on her door with this kind of politics that has women at its center, you can imagine her response. And we follow her all the way from being that young woman with squashed dreams to liberating her hometown from the Islamic State and having girls come up to her and see her as a role model. And then, of course, there's Nowruz, who the head of the Women's Protection Units, who's in your piece, Andrea, and you've talked to, and she was somebody who grew up with a mother who never really got to go to school for any length of time, who always said to her, I want your life to look different than mine. Make sure your life looks different than mine. And quite honestly, that's something my mother said to me too. And so it really spoke to me across worlds that, you know, that motivated her. And then there's a moment in the story where they're low on food, low on fuel, low on weapons, low on ammunition, but they have will. And she really invokes that as a leader and says, these men think you are worth nothing. You must show them what women can do. And I wanted readers to know them and kind of know all their marvelous complexity as people.
Well, it comes through in such an extraordinary way. I'm wondering, Senator, how do we make the American people, not the people obviously joining us here today, but when you talk about foreign engagement, foreign aid, which is such an infinitesimal part of the budget,
Right.
And there's so much resistance to that these days, not just after the last 4 years, but even before the last 4 years. How do we get people more engaged in really seeing the people behind, you know, sort of the headlines from these foreign stories?
I think it's an ongoing challenge, and it's one we've got to keep working at. Obviously, telling those stories like Gayle
Right.
has done in her book, like you do all the time on the news, is a really important way to let people know who's being affected, but also reminding people that what happens to us here in the United States depends a whole lot on what happens in places around the world. If you've been affected by a cyber attack in the last year, it likely came from Russia, China, or Iran. And it's had an impact on your life. And looking at the elections where we know disinformation, we just heard it again, that had an impact, that Russia's interference. Looking at the global competition, and we know that we are again in a great power competition. And when we look at places like Syria, where that competition is playing out on the ground between Russia and the United States and Iran, it reminds us just the stake that America has in the world. And one of the things that I've learned since I've been on the Foreign Relations Committee that I didn't truly appreciate until that time is that when America leaves the global stage, it leaves a vacuum, and that vacuum is going to be filled usually by people who are our adversaries, who don't believe in an international order, who are interested in a totally different model of governance and different values. And we're seeing that as China, we were talking about China earlier, as China is, their Belt and Road Initiative, their efforts are playing out around the world in ways that provide competition to us. So I think it's an ongoing effort that those of us who have had a chance to meet people and hear the difference that America makes, it's like being in Syria and hearing from so many people that I talked to about how important it was to have the United States stay there. I can remember we were driving along the road, and every time we passed, this was the summer, so we passed a lot of children, they would always flash a V sign at us for victory and smile because they were so excited that America was there. And we've got to remind our friends, our neighbors, the colleagues that we work with, just how important America's role is.
We play a big role in that also, we in the media, because when was the last time you heard about Myanmar, which is getting worse and worse on the news because we have a very short attention span. The next thing that happens will be a tornado or the horrors of what happened in Atlanta this week. And, there's a small window for these stories to be examined, but we don't stay focused. And that's we don't follow up enough, I think, over a longer period of time.
And Myanmar is another place where women's roles are really important. If we look at who's doing the demonstrating, who's dying out on the streets there because of the coup, women are dying in equal numbers.
I've got some questions that were sent in advance from some of your fans, Gayle. So we want to bring some of those to you as well. One question is, weren't you afraid to be in a war zone? How do you prepare for that? How do you tell young women wanting to go into war reporting?
So I would start by saying I am definitely not this story. So any bravery I had, any shard of bravery I had was nothing compared to the women who sit in this book and whose stories were entrusted to me. I think for me personally, look, my father's from the region. We had in the prologue in the book are some of the funny conversations my father and I had about whether women really were equal and did I really believe that? And we would have lots of very lively conversations. Of course you think about the risks you take, but you also think about the work that you're doing and how much people are working to keep the world safer. And the thing that I think is surprising to people, I'll give you two answers. One is the thing that I think is surprising to people is how in some ways in northeastern Syria, your biggest foe is complacency. Because what this partner force actually was able to create is this sense of normalcy where kids are going to school, shops are opening. I spent a lot of time, I had the privilege of going to Raqqa multiple times and just seeing the energy and the vigor with which people are getting on with their lives. And I interviewed a young woman who was part of the security forces there, whose father had, of course, said he wanted her to be part of rebuilding her city after ISIS. And I said, what do you say to people who think young women shouldn't be here? And she'd say, that's ridiculous. I think they think like ISIS. And that was just such a powerful statement. So to have the privilege of being able to show that there really is no other. It's just us. We're all in it together. And that the values that we as Americans hold are universal. And so many people, including these young women on the front lines of extremism, are doing the world's work. And to really remove the distance between us and them, what a huge privilege that is to do. And I think the second piece is, look, I lost my mother when I was a girl to breast cancer. And I think that gave me a very strong sense that our time on earth is finite. And as that you must do work that matters. And as Kamala Siddiqui from The Dressmaker, the first book I did about a teenage girl whose business supported her family under the Taliban, her father used to say, you do as much as you can, for as many as you can, for as long as you can. And I fall short in that all the time, but I think it is words to live by. And so, I am most definitely not superhuman. I work to mitigate as much risk as possible. I work with amazing people. But at the end of the day, you have to think that what you're doing matters to people you'll never meet. The amazing women in book club in North Carolina I talked to yesterday, right, who see themselves in this story. Senator Shaheen and you here today, folks in Cleveland who wrote me the other day, just to be able to inspire people at a time when we need inspiration from maybe one of the last places people would expect. I mean, what a gift that is.
And Senator Shaheen, you, of course, with your constituents, are communicating these issues all the time. How much do they ask you about what's happening in other countries, especially during the economic downturn?
Yeah, not a lot. No, because most people are worried about the things some of the women in the book were worried about. They're worried about, can they take care of their kids? Can they feed their families? Where are they going to live? And during this pandemic, how do they ensure that they get vaccinated and they keep their families safe? So, and I understand that. That's what everybody should be worried about. But the exciting thing, and the point that you make, I think, in the book, Gayle, is that there are also opportunities to do things that make a difference in other people's lives. And when people have a chance to do that, most people take advantage of that opportunity. I was at a food distribution site this morning in New Hampshire, and I was talking to some of the volunteers who were there and thanking them. And one person said to me, oh no, you don't need to thank me. This is a gift for me to be able to do something that makes a difference for people. And that's essentially what the women in your book are saying. They made a difference, not just for themselves, but for so many who will come after them.
Yes, and maybe Andrea, just to that point, right? Look, I grew up in a community of single moms in PG County, Maryland, right? I came up as far from a world in which that was rarefied or where the air was thin as you can. And I write for those folks, right? I write for my godmother who calls me and says, I didn't really understand a lot of this conversation, but I really loved this story. And now I see why you had to go. And that is part of what I think is the work, right? Is to go beyond the conversation about nameless, faceless people, shooting at nameless, faceless people, and to show the stakes. And young women who took up arms, not because they thought they were going to fight ISIS or be catapulted onto the global stage by the United States, but just to protect their neighborhoods. And Azima, right, we all have women in our family who don't take no for an answer and who will do anything for their neighborhoods. To remove that, I think it has been just amazing to see people's reaction to it.
Now, Azima, who, as you write, was wounded at one point, shot in the chest, a bullet lodged near her heart, but insisted on, getting out of bed and appearing at the victory celebration to show that they had won, they had defeated ISIS, and that women had played that role.
Yes, right, and that women were part of that victory.
Another questioner wants to know about Pope Francis's recent trip, the historic pilgrimage to Iraq. He spoke at Mosul, as you know, and once the stronghold of the ISIS caliphate, condemning ISIS terrorism while calling for forgiveness. Gayle, I guess, what do you think that visit accomplished?
I mean, it's the art of hope, right? The art of talking about in a place that was known, think about the locations where the Pope spoke. Same place where Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi had, made a pronouncement that was the opposite of that message. And I think we all need a moment of hope and reconciliation. And Rasha al-Akidi, whose family is from Mosul, has written some beautiful pieces really about this and talking about what is the next moment from there. But I think just to bring a message that was the opposite of that shared by the Islamic State is just incredibly powerful.
Senator, another questioner is asking about ISIS-linked militants who are reportedly beheading children in Mozambique, and U.S. Special Forces are training the Mozambique military to fight ISIS. So as ISIS now spread, there are ISIS units in Afghanistan. How much is it a continuing threat?
Well, one of the points that Gayle talks about in the book, and I can't remember who you're quoting as saying this, but they talk about the fact that, excuse me, it's much easier to kill a terrorist than it is to kill an ideology. And that's the challenge we've got with ISIS. It is an extreme Islamic, many Muslims I know don't even consider it an Islamic ideology because it's so extreme. But it has spread to places around the world. It is a reminder about the fact that America is not isolated from those kinds of terrorists and behavior. We saw it happen across Europe, and the height of ISIS, we saw it in the United States, where people got radicalized by the ISIS philosophy. And sadly, we have tens of thousands of families and detainees who followed ISIS that we have not yet resolved what to do with them. And as you point out, Andrea, the focus has gone on to other challenges that we're facing, but that's a piece that's left undone that is going to continue to affect ISIS' ability to radicalize people around the world. We're going to have followers who are going to leave those detention camps and go other places. So it's something that just because we defeated them and took back Raqqa doesn't mean that we've defeated the ideology, and we've got to think about how we do that. And we need a strategy that involves not just the United States, but other countries around the world.
Do you, Senator, see a chance, a prospect of any kind of diplomatic solution? We've gone through so much with Syria in this very long war, and there doesn't seem to be any diplomacy underway.
Well, I think there isn't right now. I do think that the detainee question is going to continue to be at the forefront. It's going to come back to the forefront, I should say, and be an issue that certainly the West is going to need to deal with. And I think that then maybe offers a hook for us to think about how we address not just Syria, but what's happening with ISIS across the Middle East. And clearly it's not going away. So we need to think about it. And as we're dealing with some of the other international issues, whether it be China or Russia, we also need to remember that this is going to come back to the front burner, and we need to have a strategy for how we're going to respond. And we need to recognize that it's one that also needs to involve the Syrians on the ground, the people in the Middle East. I've been in touch with a number of Syrians who are part of the Syrian diaspora in the United States. And one of the suggestions one of them made to me is that they would really like to be able to have members of their organization sit down with folks at the State Department and give them their perspective on what we should be thinking about in terms of a longer term strategy to deal with Syria. And I thought that was an interesting idea, something that we don't do all that often, but as we're thinking about how we address the situation long term, we need the Syrians' voices to be part of that effort.
And certainly the pandemic has, frozen
absolutely
any kind of personal diplomacy or, codels, as you point out, for traveling and meeting with people in the region. Gayle, there's another personal question from one of your fans. As a mom of boys, what do you tell them about what and why you do what you do, and about the role of women?
In a funny moment when I was working on Ashley's War, which is the second book that I had the privilege of writing about an all-women special operations team that was recruited for Army Ranger and Navy SEAL missions in 2011 here in the US, while women were officially, as a matter of policy, banned from ground combat. And so a lot of the soldiers who were part of Ashley's War would come through the house or would be seen. And so I was telling them when I was going to work right afterward on this book, and I said, oh, I'm going to go meet with the soldier. And my son said, what's your name? And I started laughing because, my husband had been part of the Navy, and we started laughing about, it goes to just, of course, that would never have been my first question, right? But what he had seen. And so much of it, I think, is not about words. It's just about example. And, I grew up with women who got on with it, right? My mother worked at the phone company when there was a phone company during the day, and sold Tupperware at night, and just taught us how to go to work without asking how you felt or whether it was okay. No, it was, my mother said, on a scale of major world tragedies, yours is not a 3. And you keep pushing forward. And I think if I can be any kind of an example that comes near what she offered me, then I will have done something.
That reminds me of something that Madeleine Albright used to say, that one of her granddaughters, when I guess John Kerry became Secretary of State after Hillary Clinton and Condi Rice, and of course, knowing her grandmom rather, said, can a man be Secretary of State? Which of course really amused me. Madeleine knew this because when she first was sworn in, the day she was sworn in, one of the top men at the State Department that evening objected to something I had written on the nightly news, a profile on Albright as the first woman Secretary of State. And I had said that she was determined to do something about gender discrimination in the Foreign Service. And he took issue with it and said, I don't know who your source was for that, but there is no gender discrimination in the Foreign Service. And all I could think of to myself, having, of course, had in-depth talks for years with Albright about this subject, I was just thinking to myself, you have no idea, mister, what you're about to experience. Now, there still is, and there just recently has been a Politico story about, not only sexism, but racism and how white this Foreign Service is. And we really we as a country have to do a whole lot more, Senator, about that. But what is truly integrated, and so well, is the military force on armed services. When we look at what has happened, it's really extraordinary with the volunteer army, the diversity of the army, of all the forces. When you look at our military forces, where do you think we need to be better deployed in dealing with these kinds of conflicts, such as the one in Syria, but also other conflict zones? How do we have to reposition the traditional Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force?
Well, I think it's not just about our military forces and where we put them, but it's also about how we have a broader whole of government strategy that looks at diplomacy and how our military works together with our diplomats around the world and with our aid folks, and with the private sector who we bring in. It's one of the areas where we are beginning to fall a little behind where we should be, is having that whole of government strategy to address the challenges that we face, and recognizing that our military has been amazing, but we can't ask them to do everything in Afghanistan. It's not just the military that we need to deploy there. It's so many of the people that we have over the years had there to help make a difference. And one of the things that I would point out as we're talking about the military is about 15% of our armed forces are women, and they have made a huge difference in our ability to fill the ranks at a time when we have an all-volunteer force. It has been important to have opened up the military to women. I would also point out that in the United States, we have the first law It's called the Women, Peace and Security Act, that says that women should be at the table in conflict areas. And whether it's Afghanistan, where that's been a huge problem in terms of trying to ensure that women are part of the negotiations, or in, we saw it in Colombia in trying to negotiate with the FARC. But what this says is that we know when women are at the table at the end of a conflict and they're part of the negotiations, the settlement lasts longer and is more inclusive. And so we have an effort underway in our Department of Defense, at state. I would say defense is probably a little further along, to include women as we're looking at our combatant commands, as we're thinking about how we engage with the populations, whether it's in Africa or the Middle East, Afghanistan, to ensure that women are part of that effort. And it's making a difference.
And we now have 4 stars for the first time, which is a big, big change. Gayle, you've spent so much time in Afghanistan, and now as we speak today, there have been talks in Moscow on an interim agreement, short of a permanent ceasefire. NBC is reporting today that the president is considering extending the deployment in Afghanistan until November rather than May 1st, which was what former President Trump had just determined. It's hard to imagine that there could be an orderly withdrawal if it were May 1st. And there are NATO meetings next week, obviously, to discuss all of this, because NATO has twice as many troops as we do on the ground in Afghanistan. And I think my gut tells me needs our supply lines and our air cover. That if we withdraw, NATO would have to withdraw pretty precipitously as well. But who is protecting the rights of women in these negotiations? If there is a hurry towards a peace agreement, a ceasefire, whether it holds or not, and the Taliban take over and the Kabul government is weakened by this process, what about all the gains under several administrations, the Bush administration as well, to protect, political rights for women in Afghanistan?
I talked this morning to an entrepreneur from Kabul who was talking to me about the fear that women have never felt as scared as they do right now because of the lack of security, right? This is not somebody who is new to her country, right? She knows her country well, and it's talking about the targeting and the both the targeted killings and the gross violence that is being inflicted upon Kabul, which is an amazing city with huge energy and just an incredible young generation that is fighting for its future. And I think for me, the central question is, why does it matter? Well, it matters because these are your allies in the fight against extremism. These are the people going to work every single day against almost every odd imaginable to face down extremism and to fight for education, economic opportunity, political opportunity, so that more people have more of a voice and more of a stake in their own country. And that's why it matters. And it's not about a nice to have, it's about US national security.
Absolutely. We know in countries where women are empowered that those countries are more stable, that the economic prosperity goes up, and that women give back more to their communities, to their families, than their male counterparts do. So it is, as you say, in our national interest to do this. And it should be part of all of our, it should go through all of our foreign policy everywhere.
And I wanted to also ask a question that has been forwarded, whether, Gayle, you're still in touch with the women in all of your books. And I would add to that, what has happened to their lives outside of their military engagement? How have their lives been enhanced or expanded as women in their communities because of their role in the fight against ISIS?
Yeah, so I have spoken to the women who are part of the Daughters of Kobani since via my incredible colleagues on the ground there. And I think it's, a couple of things. One is that they're so moved to see all of you, to see readers really just take their story personally and to heart, because the truth is war is deeply personal, even if we don't talk about it that way. And that's why I wanted the Daughters of Kobani to feel like you were in the room with them and spent so many hours of pretty tedious book interviews. Where were you? What did you have for breakfast? In this corner of the room or that corner of the room, right? To try to bring you into that world. So I think they're very moved. And then they're waiting to see what comes next, right? They continue to put the pressure on the Islamic State. And as the senator notes, I was in whole camp 2 or 3 times, and the young woman who is running security for whole camp, which is where tens of thousands of families of the Islamic State are today, right? Including several thousand women who were both members of the Islamic State in their own right and also married to ISIS fighters, right? And these folks are holding 2,000 ISIS fighters from international countries that will not take them back. So this might be the problem, that everybody wants to put their hands over their ears and pretend it isn't there. But for these folks, for the women in this story, that's not an option. They're holding these folks for the world as we try to come up with an international solution to this international problem. And I interviewed, she's a member of the Women's Protection Forces who had fought ISIS in Manbij as part of the Manbij Military Council and is now there in whole camp running security and trying to get NGOs to come in. And I said, did you ever think that this would be your job as you were fighting the men of the Islamic State? And she said, never. I can honestly tell you that, but these people are human too. And we're trying to figure out a solution to what comes next. And I think that says it all. These are the women in this story continue to do the world's work and America's work in making sure that ISIS does not have physical terrain from which it can plan attacks on the region, on Europe, and certainly on the United States. And they continue to really be pushing for women and girls. And there's a moment in the epilogue where I was asking Nowruz, what do you want a girl born 20 years from now to know? And she said, I want boys and girls to know that we did this for them. And I want them to know that this happened.
It really does reinforce what you were saying about women in the military, Senator Shaheen, because it wasn't that long ago that we were having that debate.
That's right. And it was a debate not just about women joining the military, but also about whether women could do all of the tasks that men do in the military. And certainly if you read The Daughters of Kobani, you would say that, yeah, women can do everything that men can do.
Are there any other lessons that you think we could learn about military force structure from the way they fought, house to house, this kind of combat? Gayle, I mean, it's so dramatic in the book.
Yes, and actually I was doing some more national security focused podcasts in addition to having done The View. So it's been amazing to be able to cross, the audiences and bring this story. And I think the thing that was so interesting to me is this whole notion, what President Biden has often talked when he was vice president about CT light or a counterterrorism light, where you had a light US footprint with US air power, but no large scale deployment of boots on the ground. And that's a whole theme that runs through this story. The senator was talking about the quest to find a Syria policy and settle upon a Syria policy, particularly after the tragedy of James Foley, and this push to say there will be no large-scale deployment of U.S. forces, but here is a fighting force that has the will to take terrain and the ability to hold it. And part of what the Daughters of Kobani does is take you into the thinking from the folks on the U.S. side who were really worried at that point they were going to bequeath this fight to their own children. And we take them to the personal conversations of folks who are saying, could this be different, right? Where we don't have tens of thousands of US forces on the ground, but you can still partner air power and advise and assist with local forces on the ground. And that, I think, is what it really set out to do and did achieve with all of the challenges that it faced. And that is, I think, something that people are really looking at, because every Gold Star family is a tragedy. And Andrea, you and I have talked about this in the context of Ashley's War and other stories I've had the privilege of telling. But if you think that to take ISIS out of Syria physically, to physical terrain, you had fewer than 10 US combat deaths, and local forces lost 10,000. I mean, these people sacrificed a young generation across communities, Arab community, Christian community, Turkish community, Armenian community, and certainly the Kurds. And so I think that is something else that when we talk about people with stakes on the ground, who are doing the fighting and the dying for the world. I think this really is something that we have to know, and we have to know who they are.
I agree. And it sort of exacerbates the tragedy for me that what we did after all of the partnering and the losses of our ally, the Syrian Defense Forces, that we then said, okay, we're done now. We're going to leave you and you're on your own. And that to me is a tragedy, not just in terms of the women and men who fought in that effort, but what it says to other potential allies in the future about whether they can count on the United States. I hope that we will do everything possible to show that whenever we partner with somebody, it means that we are in it and they can count on us unless we renegotiate terms. You know, the other thing that I thought was really interesting, Gayle, was how much leadership and the importance of leadership was underlined as you told the stories of these women, because it was really the leadership of those particular women that you highlighted that led to the success. It was Azima saying, I am not going to die in Kobani. I'm not going to let us fail in Kobani. And sort of that approach in Manbij and in Raqqa, it was saying, you know, we have taken on this leadership mantle and we are going to follow it to the end. We are going to see it through. And I hear from that a lot on the Armed Services Committee from our generals and military leaders who talk about it is the people in our armed forces who are the biggest asset that we have. And I think sometimes that gets lost as we're talking about, you know, the F-35 and the new missile system and or whatever it is. It is the people ultimately who win wars. And this book is a reminder of that.
One of the most poignant and frightening things is just the cold reality of it, that the women carried grenades because they knew what would happen to them if ISIS captured them. So there's one woman who in particular was martyred that way by blowing herself up to avoid capture.
And that's the thing, that it's like the leadership piece and that kind of the will is something the Americans talk to me a lot about for the Daughters of Kobani. And there's a moment where there's a US soldier who has been through, he really spent his entire adult life at war. And he goes to a rally point before and he sees, 30 young women in a flatbed truck hugging each other, some with flowers in their hair, all with braids and Timex watches, and then AK-47 slung around their shoulders as they're going off to fight ISIS. And when I really was speaking with him about it, it was so moving because he's, I had this mix of, envy that they were going to the front, and because of policy, I couldn't, right? As a warrior, which that's my job. Guilt, because if I went, I could have protected some more of them, right? I've seen a whole lot more war than most of them had. And he said, and then just deep respect. And he said to me, he really thought about the 1962 MacArthur speech at West Point, duty, honor, country. And he said, that is who they were. And I wanted people to feel kind of what he felt like as a representative of the United States, sitting on the side of the road watching this fight against men who truly trafficked in inhumanity proceed.
Senator, you were talking about abandoning our allies. I mean, that is what precipitated General Mattis,
Right.
Secretary Mattis, to take the dramatic step of submitting his resignation.
Well, that's right. He and Brett McGurk both. And you talk about Brett McGurk and the importance of his leadership in the fight and trying to bring together the elements that can ultimately help us defeat ISIS. And both of them said, we are not going to stand by and watch the United States undercut our ally who has meant so much in this fight against ISIS. And sadly, that was all those people, the two of them, the principled people who had fought in this fight could do to try and address the policy implications of what the administration was doing.
it just, and how did that strike the women themselves on the ground?
Yeah. So there's actually in the book where actually Brett McGurk's letter is read. And so the 2-year anniversary of the end of the ISIS fight is Tuesday. That will be the 2-year anniversary from the ceremony where Ambassador Roebuck gives this very moving, short but moving talk about what this fight has meant to the United States. And it's really outlined in the book. And we see Azima and Rojda next to each other, Azima kind of sneaking a smoke as Rojda's elbowing her, right? And as there are all of these people who have dedicated a half decade to fighting ISIS come together in this moment. And I talked to a lot of people during that October 2019 incursion, and there was just disbelief at the beginning from all sides of people who were involved. And then they went back to the art of getting on with it. And that's what I wanted people to see, is that even when dealt truly a really wretched hand that was, the US had asked them to destroy their defensive positions, right? I mean, this was at the express request of the United States, not just days before. Even then, I wanted people to follow Rojda going back from having liberated some Yazidi women from the Islamic State in Ain Issa, and then going back to Ain Issa to defend it, but this time on her own. And to feel that. All that said, when I was there in December 2019, what struck me most was how enduring it is, what they've built, which actually shocked me. I mean, I kept asking everybody I worked with and all of the people I've met, is this still in place? Is the Raqqa Women's Council still in place? Is the Raqqa Civil Council still in place? Is Tabqa Council? Yes, yes, yes. And that is a testament to what they have built that is owned by those among whom it is governed, right? And it's not that it's perfect or everybody's singing, kumbaya and holding hands, but it's that it is enduring and it works and it's giving people a voice to be able to move forward with their own lives, which Syrians across communities are doing for themselves. And I think that is what it gives you so much hope when you see it. And actually it's so deeply inspiring that it's with all the challenges, they continue to press forward and lead the fight, not just against ISIS, but for stability and for a voice for women and girls.
Well, I can't think of a better way to conclude this from you, Gayle. Final thoughts, Senator, about the Daughters of Kobani and what Gayle has portrayed here.
Thank you for sharing their story and for reminding us that even in the darkest times that there's hope when people take the lead, and how important it is to have those women leaders who are there on the forefront, trying to make a difference in their communities and in their countries.
Well, let me just say, what a privilege it is for me. Senator, you are such a leader and such a role model for many, many people around the country, and certainly in New Hampshire. And Gayle, you are just an iconic figure in journalism for women. And we celebrate you. We're so pleased with the success of a truly deserving book and a great story. And it's a tribute to you, but of course, importantly, to the women you profile and have portrayed so brilliantly. Thank you also, of course, to our colleagues at the Wilson Center for all that they do and for the great work that they do and continue to do. And for letting me be part of this, and for all of you for joining us today. The book is The Daughters of Kobani, and it is an inspiring story. Okay, thank you all.
Thank you.